Bulavanaka, kia ora, good morning, and for those calling in from other points on the globe, for whatever time of day it is, welcome to this second and final day of the Pacific Indigenous Peoples and Climate Crisis Workshop Lessons from the Frontlines. For those who are just joining for the first time, my name is Catherine Murupaenga-Ikenn. I come from the Maori peoples of Ngāti Kuri and Te Raroa in of the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I am a senior Indigenous and Minorities Fellow at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Regional Office for the Pacific. So welcome. Before we get going, just a few housekeeping matters. These sessions will be recorded, so just to let everybody know, we have a chat box, and we're encouraging people who are here online to post your questions, your comments, and we will be using those in the question and answer period after our panelists have given their presentations. So we invite people to make a succinct question, and also we'll be taking questions from the floor in the room in Suva. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers, and I'll do this one at a time in order, beginning with Mr. Mike Smith. And our session for today, of course, is lessons from the front lines, insights from campaign case studies. So that's the topic for this morning's session. And our first speaker is Mr. Mike Smith. He's coming from the Maori peoples of Ngāpuhi Ngāti Kahu from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And he's representing the National Iwi Chairs Forum on Climate Change Leaders Group. And Mike, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and Bulavanaka to our whānau in Suva. And thank you very much for hosting this session this morning. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss the issues facing us here in the Pacific. And greetings also to the rest of our colleagues on the panel this morning. So just by way of background, there are approximately 1,500 hapu groups across Aotearoa. Hapu are the sub-tribal groups made up of collections of family that control territorial areas, villages, and resources, and they're the basic political unit within our tribal structure. So we've got 1,500 of those. They all come together in forums, and we call those and under iwi structure, which is our tribal structure. So and most of these are aligned to iwi runanga, which are like tribal councils. So there's 84 tribal councils across the country. We come together 4 times a year, and we meet to discuss issues of concern to Maori people. There are 5 domains. One is the Pautake Āhuarangi, which is climate. There's the Pautikanga, which is governance and treaty issues. The Pautangata, social domain. The Pautahua, which is economic development. And the Pautaiao, which is the environmental domain. So on the climate Po has 2 chair people. There's myself, and there's Lisa Tumaha, who's also the chair of the Ngaitahu tribe of the South Island. We've got a team made up of these individuals here. Dale Takitimu, for those of you that have been around the UN, traps would be familiar with her. She's done a lot of work on the UNDRIP and various representations in the UN over the years. Raihania Tipuki, for those of you in the Waka community, he's the Kaihotu, or the captain of one of our Waka Holdera, which is, you know, the double-hulled waka that sail around the Pacific, linking our peoples up. You would know Raihania. Hineka Mako, she's from Taranaki. She's one of our key organisers, and Jamal Morgan, who's also from Te Waipounamu. So that's our kind of core team. What we do is we're involved in governance issues, exactly what Catherine's been talking about, like in terms of working across national, local, tribal, international governance with the objective of transforming leadership from either the inertia that they may have and the fact that they're not dealing with climate issues, transforming leadership across to climate awareness action across the sphere of governance. And so the governance linked to individual and collective action, so that's specific campaign actions, and the objective there is to increase engagement and participation in transformational programs of whatever shape or form, whether or not that be mitigation against the causes of climate change or in adaptation spaces, that has got to be transformative. All of that's informed by science and technology. So we do this GIS mapping where we can visualize the impacts of climate change and we can distribute that information across our communities. We can link it with our mātauranga Māori, which is our traditional knowledge, find how that integrates together or where it separates. And then of course, everything that we do is empowered by economy and finance. So we've got an objective of increased investments in transformative programs. So I've been working with the Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and we're setting up a $10 billion climate action fund that'll be used to power the activities that we're involved in. So, but not only are we involved in that kind of work, we're also activists, and we're on the front lines of climate activism. And so there's myself taking part in one of those actions. Here's your moderator getting dragged off by the police, Miss Catherine Murupaenga-Ikenn. So while she's working in sort of UN activities on one hand, she's also, like all of us, we're all frontline activists that take part in direct action against fossil fuel companies, governments, and other measures as well. So we're not just pointy-headed governance or policy people. So we've been mobilising our communities, and what I want to talk to you about is the Waiho Papa Moana campaign, which was to stop deep sea oil extraction in our country. There was a 10-year campaign that we waged that successfully booted out a great number of oil companies that were wanting to come into our country and extract oil. So as I understand it, the task is to talk about what are the lessons that have been learned from our campaigns and share that with you. And so it was a widespread campaign that happened all over the country. We mobilised many of our communities. Oops, so I'm just going to stop sharing there for the moment and go back onto the screen. Just stand by for a minute. I'm just going to pull my notes up. And so so the success of our campaign was characterised by these following things, and I'll just run through it quickly. One of them was Maori Leadership, and that we had key tribal leaders and communities engaged in the campaign, and they were front and centre. They weren't a token Indigenous clip-on by somebody else prosecuting the campaign. It was led by us, and we found we allied with others. And so the partnership approach with non-Indigenous allies involved us defining the roles, the responsibilities, the communications and how that would roll out, the planning and the organisational aspects. So we had to take a lead role in the design and implementation of all the facets of it. It was characterised by good strategy and tactics. And initially we targeted the community, the companies, because we didn't believe that our government was receptive to a change in policy direction. So we went after the companies. We identified the risk. We went after the companies in terms of brand damage. We wanted to damage their brands. Direct action, which resulted in cost and delay, and undermining shareholders' confidence. So that were, I think, were the essential elements of our campaign. Another key aspect was investment in capacity, and that's where the NGOs came in, because they had money but we had people. And whereas we didn't have money, we had the people, and where they had money, they didn't necessarily have the same reach in people. So we put these two things together, and we had the components of a good campaign. Digital media was a key aspect in what we were doing, and that the campaign developed in parallel with the advent of social media, so Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all these platforms were starting to pop up, so we were able to take advantage of those. We relied heavily on mobilizing our populations, so we created media events that would broadcast the issue, raise public awareness, give people an opportunity to come and participate. And the further aspect was key direct action, which meant picking fights with the companies and elevating the campaign. And then once we actually engaged in a fight and they had to engage with us on that level, all of a sudden things got a lot more serious. They had to take us a lot more seriously, and they had to pull more resources, because at first they just tried to ignore us. You know, you would have heard this expression. First they ignore you, then they denigrate you, then they fight you, and then you win. And so it was part of that cycle, if you like. Escalation, and the escalation aspect was the relentless visualization of growth. So we had to show that our movement was growing, it was getting bigger, and we had to visualize that in some way. And so we looked for every opportunity to do that. Numbers, at the end of the day, it was the numbers that won the campaign for us, because once we tipped the political scale and showed that we had a vast number of people in our society supporting us, that's when the government were compelled to act, and so they did. So that's my brief. I don't know if I'm anywhere near 10 minutes, Catherine, but given that we're trying to go quite fast and we've lost some time, that'll be the extent of my introduction as to what we're doing and some of the key learnings that we learned along the way. So, kia koutou anō. Tēnā koutou.
Kia ora, Mike. No, you're bang on. That was on 10 minutes. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I hope our audience has taken away some of the practical issues in campaigning that we need to be aware of. And we can all take that on board in our own campaigning. Very inspirational. Kia ora to you, Mike. So we'll move on to our next speaker. We did have Mr. Sele Tangivuni scheduled. I think we might be having some technical difficulties. So what we'll do is we'll move on to our speaker from 350.org, Mr. Joseph Sikulu, and he comes as the Managing Director of 350.org for the Pacific. So Joseph, may we hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Malo talav mai pongpongini and Bulavanaka to everybody's joining us from Suva. I'm joining in today from Sydney on the land of the Darug people in Australia. So I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I also pay my respects to everybody who are on this call today. Just a bit of context onto who we are as 350 Pacific. We're a climate change advocacy group that works to amplify, inspire, and connect young people, young Pacific people all over the world, in the islands and in the Pacific diaspora. As 350, our work is targeted at accelerating the end to the fossil fuel era, but we're also known as the Pacific Climate Warriors, and our work is to shift the narrative the world has held on the Pacific in the climate crisis from one of victimhood to one of empowerment. And a big part of that work is creating the resilient systems we know will empower our people. We work with young Pacific people in 15 Pacific Island nations, and also young Pacific people in Australia, Aotearoa, and the USA. If you're interested after this call, we do have an office in Suva. Just pop in there and have a chat to them. I wasn't sure what could be too useful within this discussion, so what I will do is just provide a bit of context into our work and some of the campaigns, and then any questions you have after we can answer. We have spent a lot of time developing our style of activism. It's something that comes naturally to us, something that is centered in story and culture. We know those are the most powerful tools we have, and when we leverage those stories, when we leverage the moral voice in service of a strategy or campaign, then we don't just become a frontline voice sharing our truths and our stories, we become a real catalyst for change. As a Pacific, we have worked really hard over the last 10 years to drag the global conversations of the climate crisis from one of just around science to one that centers and amplifies the realities of those who are living on the front lines of it. And that's the power of activism that's grounded in story and narrative. Our campaigns and our strategies develop and evolve every year, but what doesn't change are the ideals that we use to organize. If we amplify, if we inspire, and we connect our people, then we can achieve our goals. When we're thinking through these things, we're thinking questions like, how do we empower and build the capacity of our communities with training, with tools and resources so that they can take part in our campaigns? How do we make our campaigns accessible and easily replicable? And how can we take huge concepts like the climate crisis, the different UN processes that we're part of, fossil fuels, fossil finance, and demystify these things so that they make sense to our people on the ground? These are the things that we're always thinking about when we're planning out our work. When you think about those things, then it doesn't just become about organizing or campaigning to win. It becomes about building and empowering the systems within our community to liberate our people. And that's where the real work is. I don't have a slideshow, but I can show you pictures of canoes blocking coal ships, cover ceremonies we've held at the edge of coal mines, the mats we've carried into the Vatican, or the thousands we've mobilized for climate strikes across the world. We've carried out so many actions across the world centered in truth and culture, but at the roots of all that is the transformative change that needs to happen within our communities. I'll talk through one of the campaigns that we have worked on. COP is always a big thing for us. UNFCCC process is where we do most of our work. And in COP23, we held our campaign called Have Your Say. COP23, you will know, especially in Fiji, was a merging of a lot of different pieces. It was chaired by Fiji, making it the first time a Pacific and small island state hosted the climate talks. It was hosted in Bonn, Germany, close to the Rhineland, which is home to Europe's largest source of emissions, the RWE lignite coal mines and power plants. And it was also the first COP since Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement. And finally, this was a COP where the implementation plan for Paris was supposed to be defined. For us within 350, COP23 was also huge because it was the first time teams within Europe, the USA, and the Pacific ever collaborated on something together on a major project. A core mission of COP was to prove to negotiators that living up to the Paris Agreement meant we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. However, we also know that COPs are about so much more than what goes on inside the talks. It was an opportunity to highlight the communities and countless people around the world who are doing what it takes to move us beyond fossil fuels and to strive for climate justice. And COP, or UNFCCC, and sorry to use the term COP, or I know it's jargon, but I'm talking about the United Nations Climate Conference at the end of the year. These are always a chance for us to remind governments that as they sit and talk, people's lives and their livelihoods, their homes and their futures are on the line, and that we're still here having these negotiations after 20 years. And so it's important that in our work that we continue to show that if our governments don't lead, that our people will stand up and do what it takes. You need to show them what true leadership looks like. When we were thinking about this thing, we knew the vision that we wanted. We wanted to ensure that we can bring the Pacific into Germany, the Pacific into the UN space, the Pacific into COP space. We wanted to bring that flavor and our people into it. And so we set ourselves a few goals. Number one is to build moral urgency. We wanted to work with people across the Pacific, our allies, to raise the level of moral urgency and draw a line in the sand. We know that if countries want to live up to the Paris Agreement, they must keep fossil fuels in the ground and switch to 100% renewable energies. Number two was to push for a coal phase out. In Germany at the moment, they were pushing for a coal phase out, and they wanted to stop the expansion of the base. They wanted to expand their base in Germany, and we knew we were going there. So we wanted to ensure that we can have that connection with the people on the ground who are working. We also wanted to ensure that we can isolate Donald Trump at that time. We wanted to paint Trump's delegation as pawns of the fossil fuel industry who are out of touch with the desires of American people, while showing local efforts and solutions being led by communities across the US. And we also wanted to build momentum to connect everybody around the world, and COP and 350. And at that time we were launching a new strategic steer, so we wanted to make sure that people really understood the language behind our fossil free campaign. We had our vision and we had our goals, and we just wanted to sit down and think about all of the different things that we can do, all of the different people that we needed to target, and all of the different people that we needed to bring with us, our people, our communities, negotiators, our government, the people who we needed to target to build moral urgency. We also needed to target people in Germany who we needed to push for a coal phase out. We needed to target Donald Trump and his administration who just pulled out for the Paris Agreement. All these different targets within our goals, we then had to think about what are the different tactics we could use to move them, to shift or to empower them. we had so many different tactics, both online and offline. During that, we had things like our declaration, the Pacific Climate Warriors Declaration on Climate Change. We had our Have Your Say, which was a digital platform to support our declaration. We had offline trainings and gatherings to help build support within the community around Have Your Say and the declaration. We targeted influencers within our region to help us amplify our ask. And then in Germany, we did the many different things that we could try and do in the lead up to the climate talks to bring as much attention to it. But for us, so our actions are always steeped in culture. And then we took part in a whole heap of rallies. One of my favorite actions, even though one of our biggest actions in Germany was a civil that we held in this village of Mannheim. And Mannheim, the actual village itself, sits on the edge of the coal mine. And in order to expand the coal mine, they had evacuated the whole entire city. But one thing we knew is that we were going to go into this place that we needed to, number one, ask for that permission for us to be able to be on that land, to be able to carry out our work, and to ask it from those people who, like us, are being most affected by it. So we went into Mannheim and we gifted them with this huge tapa that was made in Tonga and around the Sevu. And then we then carried those big, huge pieces of tapa that we had turned into this big flower, and then we opened it up at the edge of the coal mine. And it was an incredible experience to have been a part of, but it also reached the people in Germany in such a real way, in that I think the importance of movements like this is our capacity and our ability to be able to stitch stories together across the world. Whether we're talking about extraction or impact, we are all feeling the effects of the fossil fuel industry, and we all need to be able to connect our story to be able to tell a wider story of a world that is coming together to fight this thing. And so that is always at the goals of what it is that we are trying to do. When we think about moments like this, we really need to elevate and amplify, and we really want to ensure that our tactics that we use lead up to a bit of a crescendo into whatever it is that we're trying to organize. So try to strategically plan things out so they tell a story. And sometimes when I think of it, I think of activism or campaigning as writing a piece of music. It has a start, it has an end, it has a melody, but when all of these pieces flow together, then they make have this beautiful journey of highs and lows, of falls and peaks. And then when you look at it all over together, it just becomes a piece of harmony, a piece of art. And that is really what we are trying to form across our whole entire region, is making sure that people understand, can see, that people who want to take part can see the role that they can play in this beautiful harmony, because everybody has a role to play, and making sure that they can take part in a way that makes sense to them. And so I think that's the real importance of any type of activism or any type of campaigning. It doesn't matter what it is, we have to make sure that our people can see themselves within it and make sure that it's accessible. Have Your Say for us was a huge success. Since it launched in September, we had, I can go through a whole heap of the data behind it, but I can see the thing coming up. So yes, I'm going to stop there, and then we can go into any questions later on. Thank you, Catherine.
Kia ora, Joseph. Look, just like Mike, you've got such a wealth of experience, and I just wanted to let the audience know that Joseph and 350 have just come off this huge event over the weekend. So Joseph is just pulling it out from himself, this last burst of what must have been quite an intense weekend. So we really appreciate you coming on, Joseph. Your energy level is so high. For people who are wondering, this is my little frog friend, and when our speakers are coming up to their speaking limit, I just sort of let them know, showing the frog. So thank you. So much information about campaigning and the conference of parties that you talked about, where all the international people will be coming together to talk about climate crisis and such. If we're wondering why we're talking about so many of these international areas, that's because at the ground level, we're affected by all these decisions being made, often without us at the international level. And that's a problem. We've got to figure that out. How do we meaningfully participate there? So thank you very much. And now we'll move on to our next speaker. Just to remind, if people have questions on any of this, please put them in the chat. Please get them ready in the room in Suva, because we'll come to you for questions and answers. Our next speaker is Miss Tishiko King, community organiser at SEED, Indigenous Youth Climate Network. And she's coming from the Torres Strait Islands. And she'll be talking, amongst other things, about the legal case against the Australian government and what communities are doing on the ground to protect what they value there. So Tish, may we hand it over to you? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you to the amazing speakers that have already spoken. It's so amazing, and I get so inspired when being a part of these conversations. Ka Pupaenga, good morning, Bula Vinaka to all of you there. My name is Tishiko King, and I'm a proud Torres Strait Island woman with strong bloodline connections to Masagan Baru Island. I would like to acknowledge country, knowing that we're all tuning in from different areas. Where I am, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Kororeg Nation of Untitled. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, people that identify as Indigenous to their homelands, and people of colour that are participating in these workshops over the next couple of days. I am the community organiser, as Catherine said, at SEED, Indigenous Youth Climate Network. But here in Australia, everyone refers to us as SEED Mob. And we have been building a movement of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to protect their land, rivers and oceans from the causes and impacts of climate change. Untitled, commonly known, is the traditional name for the Torres Strait Islands, lie in the northern tip of Queensland, Australia, and it is home to one of the most unique Indigenous cultures. The Torres Strait Islands are made up of 150 islands and with 18 island communities. It is a pristine wilderness region containing the most northerly part of the Great Barrier Reef. The area is home to one of the world's oldest living cultures, as well as rare species. And additionally home to some really incredible flora and fauna species that are endemic to that area. First Nations people are intrinsically entwined and connected to country. We are inherently part of our natural ecosystems, where bloodlines run deep into our lands and our oceans. The knowledge of our ancestors that have been passed down through generations to our elders today is a valuable asset that we as First Nations people hold. And caring for country is important to me because as a proud Torres Strait Islander, our oceans are who we are, our way of life and our language. We are so connected to our island spiritually that we really navigate our life through our stars and the sea. And so, you know, what is happening right now is I have the incredible privilege to be able to work and support with our Islands Are Home campaign, which is, I'll tell a little bit more about it in a bit, but I guess it's just about, you know, people standing up against, you know, those issues to our government. But what is happening right now in Torres Straits is, I think, quite similar to what is happening to a lot of people here in the room. And before I begin, I actually do want to just state that while I am a proud Torres Strait Islander, I live on the mainland, and these are the lived experiences from the people that are directly affected on the front lines. And so I'm just here as part of this campaign to amplify and elevate their voices. And so right now, the people of the Torres Straits are on the front lines of the climate crisis, and urgent action is needed to ensure that, you know, we can remain on our homelands. We have advancing sea levels, we have king tides and cyclones that are already threatening our homes, as well as damaging, you know, to fresh water supplies, crops, our burial grounds and sacred cultural sites. And something for me personally that I had to endure over the summer was that I had to pick up the bones of my ancestors because of the erosion from king tides. Now, I know that this could be quite a similar story to all of us here in the room. Now, I was listening to a little bit yesterday on the workshop that, you know, I think it was Willie there that said that, you know, this doesn't include the already natural events that we already have, and we are seeing shifts in our natural seasonal cues, and we are finding it harder to identify our seasons, right? Because, you know, the way that, you know, our natural weather events, they're just more frequent, more damaging, and they're lasting longer. In addition, this is not including the fact that we are still living in this uncertain landscape under the COVID pandemic. Now, a little bit about the campaign that I'm working on. What our Islands, Our Home is 8 Torres Strait Islanders have taken a complaint against the Australian government to the United Nations Human Rights Committee for failing to protect the Senator Kess from climate change, demanding Australia to rapidly reduce our emissions and immediately adapt and have adaptation measures in place, because we don't actually contribute to Australia's emissions, yet we are the most and worst affected and vulnerable to change. And as this is an open active case, I will refrain from sharing any legal proceedings, but this case is so important because it's the world's first of its kind. Our Islands, Our Home is being led by 350 Australia, and working together with client earth lawyers, GBK Land and Sea in the Torres Straits, and Seed Mob. And through the COVID landscape last year, we went through our first phase of just doing a digital storytelling. And brother there, Joe, just mentioned that, you know, our story is a tool that we need to use, right? And and that's what's so powerful, to share our stories. But as we're, you know, transitioning into easing restrictions here in Australia, we're able to shift into our next phase. And this year will be on MP engagement, where we will be taking actions, really amplifying our petitions and trying to deliver them in spaces that could be most affected to us. Our greatest challenge is that because of colonization, there is little education about First Nations culture in this country. And I think it's been part of the discussion that for some reason, you know, our traditional knowledge isn't validated enough for Western science. So a challenge we face is shifting the hearts and minds of mainlanders, because as they are not directly affected by these impacts, they don't believe it's real. And they don't, and because they've already got their resources in the city, they just are like, oh, you know, it's fine. But no, they don't understand that we still hunt traditionally, and that the lands we live on provide us with our food, our water, and our stories. And I think Valmain yesterday mentioned about how Indigenous people, we have to live sustainably. We don't have a choice, whilst non-Indigenous people don't understand what it is to have those limitations. The greatest challenge that my people face as well is that if there isn't protection of our environment, there isn't protection of our culture, and that there isn't protection of our people. And this becomes a human rights issue. The fact of the matter is that my people of Senator Kess are a minority within a minority. And I am genuinely worried that in my lifetime, my people could become refugees in our country. But it's also an opportunity, because we are at a crucial moment in our lives right now. And the way that we are occupying this planet is just not working anymore. And we need to stand together, and we need to lead this movement, because climate justice is First Nations justice. And not just here where I am, but for all Indigenous cultures across the world. We have to keep fighting, we have to keep holding the space, and we have to continue to show strength and resilience like our elders and our ancestors, so that our cultures can continue to thrive and survive for our future generations. Because if not for us, then who? And if not now, then when? And so I've got the tech team are going to show a little clip. So thank you very much for listening to me.
We as a Torres Strait Islanders living in a part of Australia, north of Australia, all Torres Strait Islanders are similar, but each island has a unique culture of its own. We have a very strong tie to this land. This is my home. This is our home.
This is their home.
This is my home now.
This is my home.
Love our island home.
This erosion is happening so fast, there won't be us left.
That's another sign of the erosion, washing the trees out.
The sea level is rising.
Our island is being washed away.
What you see here, this is what we've got. We've got nothing else to go, nowhere else to go. This is our home.
The way I see it here, that something has to be done.
The government should be accountable for this part of the world.
For the community to move down south, it's gonna disconnect them from their culture, their lifestyle.
I'm asking for help around the world so that our island will be saved.
Kia ora, Tish, did you have any final words after that video that you wanted to mention?
I just want to say, Mina Eso, thank you very much for allowing me to share the story of my elders and old people that are being affected. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And you know that that case that you mentioned, that legal case, it really is a precedent-setting one that we hope around the Pacific will look to that for inspiration in terms of strategically and in terms of tactics. What is it that we can do which will actually shift paradigms, that will actually shift and get attention, like a speaker said on the video, accountability of governments. That's what the name of the game is. How do we get them where it hurts and make them accountable? So thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be hearing about that more in the coming days, months, and maybe even years. I think now then we will go to our question and answer time. And if I can turn to my colleagues in the room in Suva, I think we might start with any questions there from the floor. We do have a couple of questions online.
We have a question online. Maybe I'll just pass to Hion. She can read it here.
All right, thank you very much. There's a question from Candida Rodriguez from UNDP. So to 350 Joseph, what are the main issues 350 Pacific is bringing to the climate negotiations this year, and how can other organizations in the region help amplify your voice? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. There are a few things that we are working towards when it comes to COP this year. We're a part of PICAN, the Pacific Island Climate Action Network, and we have our Pacific Demands. And that is our collective position as a community of civil society within the Pacific. I think it's going to come up for a bit of an update shortly, but anything we need to know in terms of what we're pushing at the COP level will be in there because it's our collective voice. One of our main priorities as 350 Pacific this year in the lead up to COP is defunding the fossil fuel industry. We know that one of the priorities for COP26 is the framework for public and private finance. So a framework that sets out what banks and financial institutions need to do in order to help facilitate and achieve 1.5 degrees. And so we have actions against banks, insurers, public funding, governments. All of these smaller actions will feed into our strategy to pressure and hold governments and financial institutions accountable at COP. The big key piece around us and our COP work this year is our storytelling. Storytelling work around the UNFCCC process is always important for us because it's one of those things that helps us demystify the process, but it's also one of those ways that we can help our people engage within the process by bringing their stories and creating that platform for them to be able to go into that. All of our policy work, all of our position work is always supported and amplified by the storytelling work that happens on the ground. And so we're always thinking about the different ways that we can weave together the physical and the metaphorical. And this year we're taking the metaphor of, actually it's Fijian, it's Kato ni mana, which is like the box that carries the heritage and ancestry of Fiji. We're taking this metaphor of a basket, and the way we want to look at our COP work this year is how do we weave together the stories of the physical impacts of the climate crisis we're facing with the story of the movement in the metaphorical way, which is our baskets. And so I guess the best way any kind of, or they want to be a part of this, if they want to partner with us, then it's just a matter of reaching out. I think if leading up to this conference, the best thing we can do is try and amplify as many voices as we can, any frontline stories as we can. There's going to be a whole heap. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like at this point, whether it's going to happen, whether it's going to be pushed back, whether it's going to be cancelled. But one thing we know to be true is that in order to support all of the negotiators or all the governments that are heading towards that, we have to amplify as many stories as we can. So I guess that's the biggest kind of support we can provide is amplification. But for anybody within, especially within Suva, that wants to take part in this, we're going to be going throughout our communities. We have weaving workshops, storytelling workshops, all of these things that we want to carry with us. They're really easily accessible. Our office is actually on Thurston Street. You can just, where the Gloria Jeans is, the door next door. You can just go knock on the building and join.
Kia ora, Joseph. Thank you very much for that answer. I hope it was helpful to people. Rob, you look like possibly you might see a question in the room.
Thanks. Yeah, actually, there's another question online, but I just wanted to note that the questions that many people wrote down yesterday, we still have them to address. So I think some of them are quite relevant in this session. So I'm going to go to Hyun first with the questions online as they're going on, but then maybe we can come back to some of the questions that were great from yesterday. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Rob and Catherine. There's a question from Patrick Earl from DTP. Asking if there are examples of focusing on the nationally determined contributions and advocacy on Indigenous people's rights and climate change, and does the process allow for engagement by Indigenous peoples and or governments from the Pacific? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So I'll throw it to our panelists if they might be aware of the nationally determined contributions for those of us who might be wondering what that is, because from yesterday, one thing became very clear. There's a lot of jargon, right, in this climate crisis space. People are discussing these acronyms, you know, these words. What do they mean? What do these terms mean? For many of us, we're unfamiliar. So nationally determined contributions, these are all about how we have global warming and the fumes from our cars and greenhouse gases, carbon and nitrogen are all going up into the atmosphere and creating this heat blanket around our planet, right? So the name of the game there is how can we reduce all of these gases that we're spewing out from human activities? And countries have said, hey, you know, Fiji or hey, Samoa, we are going to make policies so that we have cars that are cleaner and they don't make so much fumes at the back end, or our agriculture practices, the industrial agricultural practices, we're going to use less man-made chemicals and nutrients for our farming, because they're actually the ones that when they go into the soil, they release gases into the air, you know, cause global heating. So we're going to make laws to reduce all of that. And that's our target, a nationally determined target that we set. So that's what the question was around. So if any of our panelists would like to respond there, you know, how does that all play into our strategy for mitigating climate crisis impacts on our Indigenous peoples? Can I bet it to you, Mike?
Sure. Yes, and thanks for that question. It's a good question. So here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, what's happening is our government is currently developing two streams of policy. One of them is the emissions reduction plan, and that contains all the legislative reform, all of the policy that's required to bring us down to zero carbon economy. We're about 10 years behind the rest of the world because we had a Conservative National Party government for 10 years and they've recently got removed from power. And so we're trying to play catch up. So it's happening very fast. And it's within that our national contribution will be formulated. and to go off into COP. So we have been invited into the, not just to put submissions, but to be part of the co-design of that plan. So we're not being submitters, we're now being co-designers of that plan. And last week, the Cabinet decided that the Maori worldview, our conceptual worldview framework, will be the leading framework for determining our climate mitigation and adaptation going forward. And so when that was announced in Cabinet last week, many of our activist communities just fell on the ground with surprise with their mouths open because they couldn't believe that that had happened. I'm somewhat cynical. I mean, we've got a treaty with the Crown that's, you know, that's over 150 years old, and we're still yet to see that manifest in or to come true. So I'm a little bit cynical about it. But there is, we have leveraged ourselves into a more of a position of influence with our government, and it's partly about raw power. If we can mobilize our communities and have a united objective when it comes to climate, and that if we've got a split political system where there's, you know, about half and half for each of the major parties, and we sit in the middle, we can exercise that leverage to try and achieve more. But we don't have our national sovereignty like a lot of the island nations do. And so we've got to go through these mechanisms dealing with Palangi people and their political systems and trying to wrestle control from them. But I don't think they really realize what it means to have an Indigenous worldview, because what that requires is a complete dismantling of the colonial worldview. And so I'm pretty sure that they haven't realized what they've agreed to yet. They probably think it's just going to be some warm and fuzzy native stuff over on the side. But in order for that to be real and have some meaning, it means a complete dismantling of the current system, which is what we're committed to. And we believe that that's the only thing that's going to achieve, you know, what's required. So we don't have, well, myself personally, I haven't had much confidence in multilateral agreements and the COP process because it's driven by nation states. And you've just got so much work to undo the power structures that we haven't got time to do that. We've only got sort of 10, 15 years. And so while I don't detract from that work, and I think it's important that it goes on, equally, I think that there needs to be work on the ground for those countries that still are under a colonial regime of power to overthrow that power. And to, and I mean, that's a pretty big statement. And it's easier to say that, it's a lot harder to do it. And but we would hope that those of you that do have your own political sovereignty in your own hands, that you show the way and show the leadership that's required for other colonial states within the Pacific. And so, you know, we hope that you're able to use that power to elevate the worldview, the Polynesian worldview, or not the Polynesian, but the Pacific worldview, which I believe is all interconnected. So, kia ora.
Kia ora, thanks, Mike. Did any other of our panelists, Joseph or Tish, have a response, a quick response on the nationally determined contributions question before we move on? Oh, sorry, Joseph, I see you're unmuted, so.
Yeah, just to say that in terms of the NDCs within the Pacific, every country within the Pacific already has a roadmap to renewable energy. Every country is on track to meet the targets that is set within Paris. Last year marked 5 years since the signing of the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement for us it's legacy work because so many of our leaders have poured so much time into it. Note Tong and then Lesopuanga, Tony de Broom, all of these people were the architects of the Paris Agreement. So it's important that our leaders continue to push and show that kind of leadership. But it's just like Mike says, within the Pacific, our countries have the sovereignty to be able to determine this, but also they're not the highest contributors to carbon in the world. So even though we do have a roadmap to transition our communities into renewable energy, at the end of the day, we need to be focusing on the bigger countries within our region, New Zealand, Australia, and supporting and working with the Indigenous people of those countries in order to push for greater leadership within those places.
So just on that, you know, that's absolutely completely agree with that, Joseph. So on that, if we were to take a regional approach and say, well, you've identified Aotearoa New Zealand and Australia as being the largest emitters in the region, and I think what we emit here would be minuscule compared to what's potentially coming out of Australia, especially in regard to the Adani mines and those types of things. So I'd like to think that as a region, we should put our focus on and amplify the situation in Australia, and to throw our support behind the Aboriginal people of of the Queensland area and the Torres Strait Island communities, and that we really need to get in behind them in terms of their struggle as First Nations peoples who are at the cold front, excuse the expression, of that particular emissions profile. And so that's one concrete thing I'd like to think that we would do at Pacific, is to see our collective well-being being very much centered upon the ability of the liberation of the peoples, our neighbors across the oceans. So there's one practical thing I'd like to put on the table here today.
Kia ora, Mike. And that just reinforces the message that came out, one of the messages from yesterday. How do we mobilize in the Pacific? How strategically should we be, like laser focus is a phrase that you've mentioned, we've talked about a lot, in a smart way? Where is our effort going to make the most impact? It's very important that we keep doing on the ground what we do as Indigenous peoples, in our homes, in our communities, with our families, but there are these layerings of regionally and internationally. Where are the decisions being made or not, as the case may be, that's affecting us? So yeah, out of this workshop, we hope that we can generate some ideas around staying connected. In fact, in the chat, we had someone who just posed the question, can we share all of our details? Can we stay connected once we leave this workshop? Because there's obviously some people who know some of those more technical, pathways and entry points and all of this world of climate discussion and decision making. It's a mystery to a lot of us. We need some help. And also our Indigenous peoples have some really great technical knowledge of our own that the rest of the world needs to hear and know and learn about. So yeah, let's definitely think of that. So going back to our colleagues in the room, we're just backwards and forwardsing to make sure we get some good distribution and fair sharing of the time here. Any other question coming from the room, Rob or Hayun?
Thanks, Catherine. I wanted to make a quick comment as well, just about what's been discussed. As what we discussed yesterday with the human rights mechanisms, the different ones that was like in the last session, very technical. But when we talk about these NDCs, these nationally termed contributions, it's talking about what governments take as climate action, what kind of policies they make. So when we talked about the mechanisms yesterday, that's one way you can go and say to your government, Fiji, when China or when the US, the big larger emitter countries, have been reviewed, tell them to take a recommendation in the Universal Periodic Review that says, have better, stronger NDCs, or have better climate action. So that's the idea of trying to tie the mechanisms together. And I know it's very technical, but it's really just saying do more on climate action. Look at your better policies. One question that came from yesterday, but I think it's quite relevant here, was what recommendations would the panelists give due to some of the sort of direct actions being taken for youth organizations to take climate action? Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in there. One of the actions that would complement what the UN is, the pathways that the UN is offering, is to also look at some of the other bodies like the International Criminal Court. And I believe that there's the ability to take world leaders and charge them with crimes against the environment, crimes against humanity, because ultimately the decision makers that make these fundamental decisions to okay resource extraction at scale, they've got names, they're real people. It's not just like nation states. You can hide behind the nation state and the sovereignty and all those types of layers. But I believe that that there's individuals that lie beneath all of this, and they should be subject to accountability in world courts. And so we're currently looking at the possibility of lodging proceedings in the International Criminal Court against Scott Morrison. And that'll send hopefully that'll send quite a chilling message through the politicians that their disregard for the well-being of our future generations, our children and our grandchildren, will not go unanswered by their grandparents, people like me. And so we believe that these are courses of actions that we could unite and join as litigants across the Pacific, and to say that yes, we believe that that's an appropriate course of action, and we believe it's of the problems of a magnitude that requires that sort of fairly strong response, and something that we could mobilise our young people around as an issue and gain their support.
Kia ora, Joseph, did you have any comment on that and the angle about our youth? Mike brought up, which is also another reoccurring theme from yesterday. New generations coming through, they've got all this energy. We don't want to put the pressure all on them, but to be honest, they've got the most skin in the game, right? They have a right to have a say. And I just want to drop this in, an idea that I'm really passionate about is getting the voting age reduced to 16 so that young people can have more of an influence in politics and decision making. Hey, we've got to take everything at our disposal, every tool we have to shift this game. So anyway, I just throw that out to people if they want to get behind that campaign to reduce the voting age to 16 for our young people, go for it. But Joseph, I'll just bat to you in case you have any quick words before our next question.
Yeah, maybe Tish might have something to add to this too, because when we're talking about especially youth Indigenous activism, CEDMOB do some really incredible work around there and the leadership they show to help build that capacity with young people. I think that this generation of, oh, sorry, my internet is really not great, so I'm going to stop my camera there for a second. I think this generation of youth activists, there's a lot of passion in there, but there's also so much creativity and so much vision within that. And our job as anybody who works within a youth network is just to try and help facilitate them and give them the tools that they need in order to show up so powerfully to this vote. They've got so many great ideas and so many things to say and so many platforms to do it. And the energy they bring into this movement is exactly what's needed at this moment. And so I think that we should just try and, like you say, give them the support that they need in order to be able to show up to this. And if that means we're going to lower the voting age down, then I'm all for that too.
I'm hoping that this works and my internet doesn't wig out, but I mirror exactly what Joe and Mike say. And, it is something that we do focus, is that we're not trying to train our young people to be something specific. We give them the tools for them to have their voice and amplify it. And I mean, look at what we're seeing, in the last couple of years, young people are really advocating because they want a seat at the table and to be a part of the decision-making process as well. And I think that's just as important. It is very important because they're our future. And so, it's able to share, the stories that we've learned and keep passing it down to generation. And, the best thing is that there's so many young people out there that we've just been collaborating and standing in solidarity with other young organizations and groups, just like the Pacific Climate Warriors, other Indigenous groups on Turtle Island. And so it's about, standing together in solidarity. And Mike said that, we may not have the financials behind it, but we have people power. And, people power is what strike movements, right? But yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
Great, Tish, kia ora. I think we have time for one more question. Tish mentioned about people power. Yesterday, there was this phrase, we have supernatural powers. And if we descend from our universe and our gods and our creator, we definitely need to think of ourselves as having supernatural powers. With that, if there was one more question we might be able to get to before we close. It's unfortunate we weren't able to have our final speaker, Sally, here with us, but we have
Yeah,
time
if
for
there's a
one
few
more
more questions from the room,
question,
Catherine.
or
I want to ask Tishiko King, because she's talking about the environment and climate change, and she care about people and protect the people. If she's telling about she's tell about people and care of people and about protecting people, is the government help her for that? Is my comment. If the is the government help her for, that's my comment.
Thank you so much, Auntie, for that beautiful question. Trying to find a diplomatic response. Look, right now, and Mike mentioned, there's a lot happening in the political landscape here in Australia. And a big thing that SEED, our organisation, identified was that our government is using the COVID landscape as a scapegoat for their agenda. And so right now, there's a lot of federal money going towards a gas-led recovery in this country. And they've listed a plethora of reasons why, like fixing the economy, and you know, providing jobs and employment. However, I think this is where coming together and amplifying our voices and like really pushing the government towards making them accountable for what they put in their sort of like roadmap to the recovery of the climate crisis. And so, you know, this is an opportunity now that we're really just standing together with solidarity with other non-NGO groups, because it's our future, it's our collective future, and we want a just transition for all. And it's about, if it's about, you know, jobs, then it's like, let's shift to renewable jobs, clean jobs, sustainable jobs. And so it's all works in that sort of way. But I guess in plain terms, our support doesn't come from government, it comes from other NGOs from the space, and not just in the environmental space. There's an incredible movement across Australia that in the music industry, in the fashion industry, in the food and like agriculture industry. And so I think that's really important in this time, is that we, you know, make these connections with our allies and our friends and other community groups, and create this people power so that our governments have to act, because this is what we want. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Tishiko. There's one more comment in the room, so I just want to go quickly because I'm sure of the time.
Thank you. I just want to comment the speakers that I was privileged to hear from and the work that you're doing across the Pacific. I just want to reiterate again, Michael and the moderator have also talked about regional approach. And I think for us, or even like for myself, as I reflect on some of the things that you shared, it goes back, the responsibility also goes back to us as landowners and Indigenous people, and goes back to our different, you know, Matangalis, Yavuses, provinces, villages, islands, Ayingas, etc. All of us are responsible because this is our land, these are our islands. And I feel like it should not, the responsibility on advocacy shouldn't be on a few people groups or climate change groups or environmental groups. It should be all of us, including the churches. The traditional Voyaging Society has been advocating on this by themselves as well. And I think, you know, staying connected across, all of us have to inform our own families. It comes back to us. And how to do that, I'm not sure exactly, but it can go back to how we tell them, when you go back today in your own families, when is your next family meeting, when is your next provincial meeting, when is your next district meeting, when is your next island meeting, or when is your next church conference meeting? Because I mean, for us, we need to take back our ownership and responsibility for this, for this process. And I think it's always challenging for small Pacific Island countries like us to advocate against bigger developed countries who have a bit more resources, etc. But if we mobilize strategically and advocate together, we might be able to get somewhere. And so I just want to comment on the work that's been done already, but I also would like us as Indigenous people across the Pacific to take back that ownership and not necessarily to rely on the existing groups, but to do that ourselves as well, because these are our lands. We want to be able to see our next generations live on these islands. The seas belong to us. The oceans belong to us, even though there's all sorts of talk about government that they own certain part of the sea. That's our responsibility as Pacific Island people. And we are people of the ocean, like Epeli Hauhofe shared. We are connected by the seas and the land, the whenua, the vanua, the hanua, etc. And so I think that requires a lot of advocacy and awareness and education in our own communities and sharing traditional knowledge and skills that our forefathers already had across in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just jump in here and say, completely agree. That was one of the recipes for success in our fossil fuel struggles here, was the fact that the communities took the challenge on and they owned it and they led it. And so that's the key. But for me, one of the obstacles to that within, and I can only speak for our Maori family, is that we're traditional by nature. And so if you come from a traditional culture, change is something that's not necessarily embraced easily. We're about doing things the same way as the past, how the ancestors did it, etc. Because we got colonized so badly, we're one of the worst colonized nations in the Pacific, that everything was disrupted for us. So even more, we want to reclaim, rediscover, and go back to tradition. But when you're involved in a massive change environment, we have to change a lot of stuff. And so sometimes there's a real reluctance in our culture as Maori to be about change. And so the idea of change is, when it comes from younger people, can be quite threatening to our elders and to some of our communities. And so I think we've got to understand, and one of the metaphors I'd describe it, our god of conflict, if you like, is Tūmatauenga. And Tūmatauenga like sits in the village holding his weapon like this in his own little house with his head down like this, like he's asleep. And that's the world that we want to be in. Outside in the gardens and in the community, there's peace. And Tūmatauenga does not walk amongst us. He just sits there in his whare like this, asleep. But now comes the time, I think, that we are threatened by something so big that we have to lift his head up and he has to wake up again. And of course, that's going to scare people out in the village because they don't want to see Tūmatauenga. They just want everything to be peaceful and nice, but it's not. And we have to be prepared to invoke that spirit of change and resistance. And so for a lot of people, that can be quite threatening. And so I think we've got to help our people understand that there are ways, non-violent. I'm not talking about picking up weapons and going to war necessarily, but we've got to find the non-violent ways of affecting change. But more than that, in our minds, we have to be receptive to the idea that things must change systemically. Not just little things like changing the light bulbs, but big things about how we organize power and wealth in our societies. So it's how do we, for us as Polynesian people or Pacifica people, how do we get our heads around the resistance to change? So that's my question back at us.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mike. And what a great way to round off this session with referring back to our culture, those values, and those things that really hold us firm in all of this time of high uncertainty, the highest amount of uncertainty we've ever faced, but we're holding on to those things we know are true and will get us through those uncertain times. But we also do have to adapt. And this is the world we're in. It's a bit of both. It's a bit of local action and it's a bit of high level. It's a bit of holding on to tradition, but it's also adapting and doing things in a new way. And somehow we're just going to figure it out and make it through. If there were any final words from our panelists before we wrap up, we're going to try and keep to time now. I'll just offer this for a short sound bite before we close for the session. So Tish, if you're still there, I can't see if you're still there or not. Perhaps not. Joseph, did you have any final words? Then Mike, if there was anything left to say, and we'll round off. Thank you.
Nothing major, maybe just to continue along this theme. I think one of the biggest things we can do in terms of this, one of the most useful things we can do in terms of the climate crisis, in terms of all of these UN processes, is, like you say, just to have a talk and have a conversation about it. The more we can socialize these concepts, the better it will be for our people to be able to take part and be able to step up and be a part of it. There is a lot of work that has to go into shifting the way, especially a lot of people within the islands, especially a lot of Pacific people, think about the climate crisis and talk about it. The language sometimes just isn't there, or the understanding or the connection sometimes just isn't there between the climate crisis and the fossil fuel industry that's causing it. So definitely the things that we can do every day is just continue to speak to our communities about it, continue to speak to our churches about it, and shift the theology within our churches about it, and continue to shift just through conversations and talanoa, the way our people stand up and show up to this fight, because at the end of the day, we're going to need everybody to be a part of it. And the only way we can do that is to ensure that everybody has the same understanding that we have. So that's the best thing we can do. Go home and talk to somebody about this, what you've learned, and share that.
Thank you, Joseph, and I'd just like to support your sentiments in regards to what you're saying about us joining together and work together. And I'd just like to say to everybody here from the Pacific Nations that we came here from you, Maori people. We're one of the youngest people of the world, and that all the waka that came here came from not one place, but from many islands, and that formed our people. So we're a nation that's made up of many Pacific peoples who have joined together and now become one nation. And we came here to find a new land, a land that would allow expansion because of the smallness of our atolls and our islands. And that's our destiny as a people, we're to be the pathfinders to go find a new place. So, as you know, we found it, here it is. So that was our job. So when the time comes, and we're not looking forward to that, but if the worst comes to the worst and you need to come, well then come, because we are here waiting. We will welcome you, and that is our job. That's why we're here. And so so come when you're ready.
Kia ora, Mike. And with that beautiful final message, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us for this session, this first session this morning, and all of the questions that were put to the panelists. The engagement from the audience has been really great.